We are in lesson 6 of our study of a man after God's own heart. And we spent a lot of time in the early lessons talking a little bit how and why Saul was no longer a man after God. And so the throne was going to be taken away from him. And David's now, as we've been, from a historical perspective, David's been anointed. The process has been set in motion, though it hasn't been completely fulfilled yet in relationship to all the events that will surround ultimately David becoming king over the people. But if I were to ask you quickly, if I said, give me one story about David, what would you say? He killed a giant, right? So generally speaking, if I asked you to give me one positive account in relationship to David, you would probably tell me, well, David slew Goliath the giant. If I asked you for one negative, what would you tell me? Bathsheba, right? It's kind of interesting how we kind of think of David in those two extremes. We think about the young man who said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would challenge the God of Israel, and then the David who didn't behave himself very well after walking one evening. And so you kind of think of, and it's hard sometimes to kind of think of how is it that David fits a description of a man after God's own heart. And you can look at that in a couple of different ways. It did not say that he was a man who was perfect in the eyes of God. He was a man after God's own heart. You might even be able to make the argument that that's what he was when he was chosen. What God was looking for when David was selected was a man after his heart. And that's exactly who David was when he was chosen to come and lead the people. But it be that as it may, here we are now in lesson 6 of our workbook study, but we've come to this moment in the history where we talk a little bit about he and Goliath and this scene that happens in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And so tell me a little bit about what's going on here with the people of God, and who are these Philistines? Okay. And who is of Cush and who? Ham. And who are they?
Ham's the son of Noah.
Say it one more time.
Son of Noah.
Okay. So Ham is the son of Noah, right? Tell me the other two. Jim, Ham, and Japheth, right? That's how we generally think of them. It's kind of like, I know I said just like, and then it went woo right out of my brain. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? We generally think of some pairs or triplets like that, and we generally think of them together. Or if I ask you, name me the 12 spies that went into the land of Canaan. You can tell me which ones. You can tell me 2 of them probably. And some of you might be able to come up with some of the other 10, but generally speaking, we kind of hone in on certain things. They are descendants that they can actually kind of point clear back to the time of Noah, in terms of where they came from and the descendants, the line that comes down through them. But they are a thorn in the side of God's people for a long, long time. They create challenges and difficulties. In fact, now again, my obviously my brain's not firing at all cylinders today, apparently. But if I recall correctly, when the Israelites came out of the Promised Land, Moses had to lead them away from where the Philistines were because they weren't ready for what yet? They weren't ready for battle yet. They weren't ready to go into war. So they've been slaves in Egypt and basically just been servants in Egypt for a long, long time. And so when they're led out of the Promised Land, they're not led in a direct route. They're led in kind of an obscure route. And the reason for that was they're not battle tested. They're not ready to go fight. In fact, they're not really going to fight until when? Didn't know this really, but until how many years later? 40 years later, right? They're not actually going to go into battle and take over the Promised Land because of Moses' failure and the complaints of the people before they get their opportunity to go in there. But let's get back to David. So you have this scene where these Philistines have just been a challenge to God's people over and over. And they've got this one warrior that nobody seems to be able to deal with. The giant known as Goliath. And so David's young guy, he gets sent down there for what purpose? All right, so he's sent down there to check on his brothers and to take them some supplies and things to sustain them. And he becomes very curious about why people of God seem to be challenged in such a way that they can't deal with this one Philistine in his mind and address the challenges that Goliath was bringing. And so let's jump into these questions. We've set the stage, and I said before we're going to try to get to the questions as quick as we can because we're trying to be as practical as we can in the study. And we answered question 1 already in that discussion. So what did the Philistines' champion propose? So what was the offer? Yeah. So basically, it's let's have a mano a mano, and the winner, right, will enslave the others. And so that's the offer that had been placed out before them. But the problem is, why didn't anybody accept it? Yeah, let's look at him for a minute. So they're here in verse 4 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. So there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. We generally think of him about how tall in our numerical system. About 9 feet, maybe sometimes 9'6", if you give that little extra. But anyway, about 9 feet tall here. If 6 cubits, if we're right, and that's 18 inches. And again, that's debatable. We don't necessarily know those accurately. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. Not only is it big and heavy, and he's big, but it's expensive when you think about the amount of metal that would have been precious in those days in relationship to this. He had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like... I do that every time. Now my eyes aren't going to find it. Which verse was I? Why is that doing it? 7. There we go. Weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before. So he's got a staff of spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So he's got all this protection, and then there's a shield bearer that walks out ahead of him. It's quite a spectacle. That's the point. It's quite a spectacle. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and you servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me, and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him, and kill him, then shall ye be our servants, and serve us. And so, why aren't the Israelites sending anybody? You're afraid of it, okay? The key to this idea is, and from a practical discussion, is that this is crippling. Fear creates challenge, not just because of this physical circumstance that you're dealing with this giant that has basically challenged, send somebody out here to fight me. And it's known that he's a champion. That's the narrative. It's known that probably nobody has ever what? Defeated. And he's the champion, right? Here's this massive human being. He's well guarded and protected. And he basically says, just send somebody out and we'll have this fight, and the winner gets to enslave the others, and nobody's going out. Nobody has stepped out to take on the challenge. And so you're in a bit of a stalemate in some senses in relationship to these difficulties. So keep moving forward here, back into the text. Verse 10, the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Sometimes we become so afraid of doing what we know is right, and we're afraid, they're afraid to trust God. And that's the point that David comes down and makes with them. Your fear is that God won't lead you through this. Your fear really has more to do with your lack of trust and faith in God to carry you through this difficulty. Question 3. Israel's reaction to Goliath conjures up memories of an earlier generation who encountered giants when they spied out Canaan. How did the spies characterize themselves and their prospects for victory when compared to the entrenched enemy? And so we referenced Moses a little bit ago, and they led to the wilderness of Paran, and they're sent out to spy out the land. And they gave this great report, right? Initially. It's exactly like God described, right? That's what they say. It flows with milk and honey. Look, we had the confidence to go grab a cluster of grapes, and it took 2 of us to carry it back. I've often wondered about that. Can you imagine? I've never called anybody and called Bob up and said, "Hey, Bob, I need some grapes from Walmart. Will you run up there with me? I can't carry them in the house." Right? That doesn't happen, right? We don't think of something, but you can imagine a single cluster of grapes that you'd have to put on staff and carry. But basically, the land was perfectly suited to sustain God's people. But ultimately, they said, nevertheless, there's great men there. And they said, we saw who? The sons of, you may remember his name, Anak, right? We saw the sons of Anak there. We're a bunch of what? We're grasshoppers, okay? We're grasshoppers in their sight. There is no way we can go fight these people. There is no, that's the mindset. Fear led them to fail to do what God had already promised them they could do. And I think that's really kind of drives that point home. This, especially in the days of Moses and the Israelites, God had already said to go see the land which I'm giving you. It's yours. But they didn't have enough faith to trust that God could do that. The sons of Anak, they're giants that live there. And how in the world are we going to be able to accomplish that? And the parallel, and we'll get to this before we're done today, is that sometimes we see the challenge before us as the giant, and our God, in our minds, in some ways, is incapable of being able to handle that. Now, we wouldn't verbalize that necessarily, right? We wouldn't say and verbalize that, well, God's not big enough or strong enough or powerful enough to deal with this situation that's in front of me. We would never say the words necessarily. But our conduct kind of illustrates it sometimes. Where we don't put enough faith and confidence in God that He can carry me through this. This giant, whatever it is in front of me, isn't bigger than the God that I serve. And to me, that's the great lesson. That's the great practical lesson of David and Goliath. Is that it wasn't that David was already a great warrior. He will become one, by the way. He will become a great warrior. In fact, he becomes such a great warrior that God says, what about him building the temple? Hey, you're too much of a man of blood. You're a really good warrior, David, but that's not the imagery I want stamped on my house. And so he bypasses David and gives that job to Solomon. He will become a great warrior. But up until this point, there have been signs of greatness coming. But he's still just a boy in many senses that's going to go fight this. And he does that solely because he's able to overcome fear. And he's able to recognize that his God is greater than the challenge in front of him. And that's what faith, to me, if you were to try to describe faith in a simplistic way, that to me is it. That faith allows me to see my God bigger than anything else. That no matter what it is that I'm dealing with, no matter what it is that's challenging me, whether it's physical, whether it's spiritual, whether it's emotional, whatever it might be, my God is always bigger than whatever's in front of me. And it's faith that allows me to see the world that way. It's faith that allows me to see my personal life that way. And that's why faith is so important and crucial, because it gives us that kind of strong perspective on what God can do for us. Thoughts or questions up to that stage? So in chapter 14, back in Numbers, by the way, what was the result of that negative report? Yeah, so they get pretty pessimistic, those 10 spies, and so strong. What did the people say? Yeah, we could have died. There's plenty of graves back there in Egypt. You could have just left us back there and die, and bring us out here in this wilderness, make this big long trip just to die out here. And so that's part of their mindset. So pessimistic about this, even though they've just witnessed and seen the fruit of the land, and they've heard a good report as about where they're going. But they begin to have kind of misguided thoughts about how things were back in Egypt. They had begged and begged and begged, pleaded before Jehovah to get them out of that bondage in Egypt, and then now He does, and now they begin to think, well, man, that bread we had back there wasn't quite that bad, and things weren't as rough as maybe we thought they were, and ultimately they say, let's get a leader, a captain, that can take us back to Egypt. When there's a weakness of faith that sees the challenge bigger than God, that's the result. We get into a mindset that says, I can't. And the truth is, that's true when they were depending solely on themselves. If this was about the Israelites going in and fighting the sons of Anak on their own, arbitrarily, making that decision, they probably would have obviously not been able to be successful. But they kept forgetting the great equalizer. The great equalizer was God. And they were not keeping Him in focus in relationship to the challenges before them. That's what David brings when he shows up there at the battle scene. When he arrives, he brings a faith perspective that says, why are we sitting here and allowing this man to defy our God? Somebody needs to take him on. And they all do what? Theoretically. Yeah, I mean, look around. Yeah, David, which one of us? And then he says, I'll do it. I will. I can take him on with God's help. And here's what I wanted to make sure I got to today, because I hope you took some time to think about this. So question 5 asked, list 3 figurative giants that believers might have to face today. So hopefully you gave that some food for thought and wrote down just some things that we face that are sometimes giants. They're big. They're big issues, challenging issues, not trivial things that we have to have enough faith to be able to overcome them. So throw them at me. Okay, say it again, Ron. Okay, so we have, I'll never write. C, right? And maybe we can add this word too. We deal with, and these are spiritual issues. They're challenging when you hear from religious context things that are absolutely contrary to what is stated within Scripture. And now you got to make a decision. What can I accept, and what do I have to stand against, and where am I going to plant myself? And we've got to make choices and decisions. It puts you in a hard place because you run the risk of somebody saying you're judgmental. You run the risk of the difficulties that can come from that. And yet it's a big issue because it's hurting the spread of the genuineness of the gospel in relation to that. Okay, and I assume you mean this kind, physical sickness, and it is a bigger faith shaker than I think we acknowledge sometimes. Because when we become physically challenged, it affects everything else. And it's hard. It can lend us to become consumed with the temporary and lose sight of the spiritual context that we should be focused on. And it can create a circumstance where I'm in some ways, I almost put my faith in my spiritual life aside because I've got to focus so much on this physical challenge that's in front of me, and it's hard, to convince somebody that those are the moments actually where you need to put your faith in even a higher gear. You need to exercise an even greater level of faith. But sometimes it has the opposite effect. It weakens us. But they're real and real challenges. Okay. Yeah. And you're talking about your own or somebody else's. I'm not being funny here. Both. But I think that right. So if it's our own physical issues, we can become consumed with what's going to be the end result of this. But also I think you're right, Bob, in that introducing that thought, because it's interesting how you watch folks take the same circumstance, the passing of somebody we love, and it creates a kind of a fork in the road for folks, and they have to make a choice of, am I going to let this propel me closer to God, or am I going to let this drive me away from God? And it's a big issue. It's a giant to have to try to make a decision and a choice about, how am I going to let this affect me? Some will say God gets me through it. Others say God caused it. And it's a hard thing to try to balance sometimes. And maybe some of that, and we could, from a biblical discussion standpoint, you could talk about it's a misunderstanding of how God works in the lives of men sometimes, when we get this idea that God purposely did that or purposely did this to a particular individual. But that doesn't change the reality that it genuinely affects us. And it can, I've seen it have extremely positive effects on people's faith, and I've seen it have drastically challenged people's faith on the other side. Yeah.
Make movies. God caused this. God did this. That's a punishment. Something's wrong in your family there that's causing death. They listen to the wrong things.
Right. And let me add that, by the way, and we could have more than 3, by the way, so you can keep coming. But and I'm going to put a little bit of an arrow from that apostasy, because it's a little bit tied together. But a lot of challenges to faith come because of a misconception as it relates to Scripture. People have made a conclusion that in their minds they believe the Bible teaches, and it doesn't. And then when life doesn't match their misconception about the Bible, then they want to put the Bible away. And that's a big challenge to folks. We do that more often than we realize sometimes, where we just kind of create what we think ought to be right, or what we've maybe even been told all our lives is right about some particular biblical principle. And we develop these biases and we develop these misconceptions. And when things happen contrary to those misconceptions, then I want to put faith away and put the blame on God or whatever, because things didn't match up to what I thought they were supposed to. And a greater education in Scripture can maybe help overcome that giant in front of us.
The things that the devil puts out in front of us, try to get us to stumble.
Okay. And so we could add, obviously, temptation as a giant. And the tricky thing about temptation is that giant is different for everybody. And I think one of the things that we have to kind of be honest about is that we all have a Goliath when it comes to temptation. All of us have something that is a Goliath-like figure. And it may not be the same. You might wonder, well, why is that such a big deal? Why is he having such a hard time with that? And they may look at me and say, why is he having a hard time with that? Why does he struggle with what? But it varies. And what challenges folks will differ. But we all, generally speaking, kind of have maybe more than one Goliath walking around that's hard for us to overcome.
I can think of 2 right off. It would be One is pride.
Yeah.
Pride keeps people from obeying the gospel. Pride breaks people up, marriages up, but you just go on and on what pride does.
Yeah.
And worldliness.
Yeah.
Worldliness, look what worldliness has done to the church.
Yeah.
We've lost so many people in the world, and that's one of the big challenges I think the church faces.
Yeah. And I think, Randy, that and here's maybe the challenge with this. So the offer was made. Let's go back to the picture for a minute that we're using as our analogy. So Goliath comes down and says, send somebody out, winner takes all, basically, right? And they're reluctant to go out and do that. What wasn't going to work was there was no way to compromise with that. Right? You couldn't go down and say, well, maybe, could we thumb wrestle? Would that work? Could we create some other kind? Could we draw straws? Could we? And that's kind of the effort maybe that some would try to make when they're dealing with the giants. Within the analogy, there was only one resolve that was going to work. Goliath had to go down, right? The people, they had to become victorious over that. That was the only real answer. I think what happens with us, Randy, is that we see that influx and that pressure of the world coming to bear upon members of the Lord's body, on everybody for that matter, but in our specific conversation here. And here's the challenge. That's got two levels of giant to it. It's a personal giant to the individual who's trying to deal with the pressures and the desires of the world, the things that are luring them in about the world. It's also a giant to the church. Because then the church has to make a decision in some sense. It's not, using that language in some ways kind of just because I don't know how else to paint the picture. But we can either then say, well, if we're going to keep our numbers up, if we're going to keep people in the pews, then we're going to have to start thinking differently about these worldly issues. And the giant becomes a personal problem to the individual, but then the temptation comes to the body. Because then the body of Christ has got to make a decision. Do I change a little bit of my thoughts about this? And trust me, that's exactly what's happening all over the religious fabric of America. Is that we're making choices and decisions based on making sure we keep the numbers up. And if the only option in our minds to be able to keep the pews filled is to be more permissive when it comes to worldliness, there are a lot of groups that are willing to do that, rather than slaying the giant. The answer is you've got to win the battle over worldliness. That's the only answer that benefits the individual in their eternal state, and it's the only answer that really will strengthen the faith of a body of people. It can't be compromised with, and that's, I think, sometimes what we do with the giants in our lives. We try to compromise. We're trying to strike deals with these things that we should be taking the battle to. That's what David said, right? I'm going to go take him down, is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to make a deal with him. I'm going to try to compromise with him. And so the genuine battle needs to be waged. But the temptation of worldliness and pride and those kinds of things certainly become giants to folks. And we have to have a willingness to be able to get our stones and our sling and go at it to win the battle. Go ahead, Jim.
Nowadays, we'd have to form a committee and talk about it for about a year instead of taking care of the problem.
Yeah, I think that you're, and again, that kind of gets into that same conversation about the compromise that we're and nobody wants to. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. Some people don't mind being abrasive or whatever, but generically speaking, nobody wants to hurt anybody's feelings. Nobody's looking to create pain or sorrow for it. Nobody's looking. But again, sometimes you're left with no choice. You got to stand against apostasy. You can't just sit back and say, well, we're going to have to change the Lord's body, or we're going to have to change the way the Bible speaks about that issue, because it's not conducive to whatever you're trying. No, you got to go. You got to go beat Goliath, no matter what the issue. No matter what the issue is.
It's been proven, I believe, that issues like that left unchallenged, Brian, only tend to grow.
Yeah.
Only tend to get out of hand.
Yeah.
And if you don't say something,
Yeah, and it doesn't mean it's and from a personal level, I think that the longer you let Goliath stand there and taunt you or tempt you, the worse it gets. What I love about David is when he hears about what's going on, he doesn't waste any time about it, right? When he sees what's going on, this needs to be dealt with. And I think that's a practical lesson we can learn from David in this scenario too. When the giant shows himself, deal with it. Because 9 feet will very quickly feel like 10 feet, and 10 feet will quickly feel like 12 feet, and the giant just seems to grow. Deal with it once you see it. Deal with it in a very immediate fashion.
that's why numbers have such a difficult
Yeah.
job to do, because here's these challenges. Here's the situation I have to deal with. If I don't deal with it,
Yeah.
if I don't approach that person and correct the situation, we're going to have problems.
Yeah.
And same way, as you deal with people who are delinquent and so on, you won't come. That's a tough situation.
Yeah. And balancing patience, but not letting a giant grow bigger, is a fine line sometimes. But ultimately, ignoring a situation as if it isn't there won't help it. It never has helped anything. And it's a Goliath. It's got to be addressed in some form or fashion.
We don't deal with it when it first happens. It'll get out of hand. Then you can't do nothing about
Yeah,
it.
it's a lot easier to address it in its earlier stages. Any problem is a lot more easily addressed when it's dealt with in its earlier stages than to let because then you become ingrained in it, and you become more accepting and more permissive and more compromising, and it just creates a greater challenge. What else? Any other giants you wrote down before I move on?
I wrote money.
Money, yeah. Yeah. And the Proverbs teach, I'm trying to think of the specific proverb, but give me neither poverty nor riches. Money can be a problem both directions, the Proverbs teach. And if we in our minds have too little, that can become a giant to us, where we become consumed with how can I. Truth is, the Bible also speaks about if we have too much, it can become a burden and a challenge as well. But either way, it can become consuming, and it goes back to that worldliness conversation as well. But it's certainly something that affects us on a daily basis, and can become more of a focus to us than the faith that we should be building in our relationship with our Creator. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you all were thinking these through, because I wanted to hear what you thought about these kinds of things. But yeah, and that seems like an odd thing maybe in some ways to say. But let's just go back to Randy's analogy earlier. When you're dealing with worldliness issue, if it's somebody that you have an acquaintance with, you might be able to handle that in a simpler way. When it's at home or hits close to home, completely different picture. And we can sometimes let the familial relationship affect the way we deal with things, and we can let that influence sometimes lead us and push us further away from our Creator. because we want that. Right? And there's nothing wrong with that desire to have strong family relationships and to stay connected within our physical families. There's something beneficial to that. But it cannot be to such an extreme where that influence is beginning to lead us away from our faith.
There's many things that when it's out and about, it's black and white. But when it comes home,
Yeah.
it's harder to, it's a little more gray.
The temptation is to let what was so clearly understood in a different set of circumstances be just as clearly understood when it becomes very personal. And you're right, Kim. I think sometimes that's the giant that we have to address sometimes, is to not change the way we think about what's really true about a circumstance simply because the people involved have changed. But we've been guilty of that. And I think we've all probably found ourselves saying one thing about a circumstance when it was out here somewhere, and then now we got to deal with it in our own, and then we reevaluate that. And that's not always bad. I mean, it could be we didn't handle something in the right way, and once when it hit a little closer to home, we think, well, maybe I wasn't as didn't have the grace that I should have had dealing with that circumstance. So that can happen. But the truth is, most likely or most often, it's the other way. We find that we want to compromise what we never would have before. So just to finish this up before the bell rings here, why wasn't David a soldier already? Okay, he's the youngest son, so somebody's got to basically stay back home and take care of things, right? So you send the older ones out to be the soldiers. And of what did Eliab accuse him?
He just came here to see the battle.
Yeah, you're just like people in Payton City when they hear fire truck. That's what he said. That's new translation, I guess, but that's what he said, right? You remember it. You do it. I do it, right? You hear the fire truck, and what do? And if it sounds like it stopped close, you probably go out and take a look, right? You're curious, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But that's what Eliab accused David. You're just down here because you're curious. You want to come down here and see. It reminds me a lot, by the way. We don't. Well, it's a little different in technology because we kind of, when there's battles and fighting that goes on in our world now, we view it via a 42-inch screen, right? But back when early battles were being waged, even in the Civil War, there were people sitting up on the ridge and to watch the conflict that was going to happen. And it turned out to be bigger and greater than they anticipated. And here comes, but people kind of gawk at things like that. And that's what Eliab's saying. You're just gawking. You came down here to just gawk. But David's there and going to serve the purposes of God. And he serves as a great example of how we've got to overcome the giants in our lives. And I apologize for spending most of the time there in that one, but I thought that was the most practical side of the conversation. Lesson 7, Lord willing, on Wednesday.